Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Chuck Mason, one of the past presidents of the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society, who is our show sponsor. And with me today is another past president, Sharon Hodges. And those of you who have followed the show probably are familiar with Sharon. Before she ran away down to the Northern Neck, she used to be a guest quite often with us. So welcome back, Sharon.
Good to be back, but I have to admit, I don't miss the traffic.
I could join you there. So we're going to talk about immigration and people coming over from mainly Europe. And when I was starting, I call it the Middle Ages rather than, I thought, well, everybody just got on a ship and they came over. Well, there's a lot more to the story, and the immigrant experience that my ancestors who came over from Scotland had a different experience from Sharon's ancestors that came from Germany, and I have some ancestors coming from Germany. So it wasn't just one big, this is what you do. There were lots of things, and a lot of it depended on where you were coming from and where you were going to.
And the time frame you were doing it.
So what do we want to know? We're going to talk today about Germany and people leaving Germany.
Yeah,
so
well,
what?
This actually applies not just to people going from Germany, but from pretty much anywhere. Very early on, got to remember, like in the 1600s, when people would come over, the late 1600s or mid 1600s, after Jamestown or after Plymouth Rock, the Mayflower, ships were not built to carry people. They were built to carry cargo. And what would happen is a ship owner or a captain did not want to leave a port with only maybe half a load for wherever he was going, from England to America or from America over to England. So they would take the rest of the place, maybe put up a false wall, and they would take passengers. So you were down in usually the lowest deck, and again, it wasn't made for you. And early on, you were responsible for bringing your own food, your own water, your own mattress, your own blanket. If you got to your port of departation, maybe Hamburg if you were in Germany, or Le Havre if you were in France, if that ship didn't take off on time, because they didn't use timetables, it just depended on what the weather and all was like, and you ran out of your food, you had to be able to go and buy more. If the winds weren't in your favor, because we're on sale here, you could run out of food, it could take too long, your food could go bad, your water could go rancid. If it was bad weather, the openings that would let you climb down from the deck into the lower part where you would sleep or eat, those were closed because you couldn't let water in, because what would happen? The boat would sink. So the air would get stale. Things got better as time progressed. Eventually the shipping companies were responsible for the food and what have you. But it wasn't perfect, it wasn't great. You first of all had to make the decision, am I going to leave? And that was probably one of the hardest things to decide, because you weren't going to see family or friends again. It wasn't like, we could today go down the airport, get on a plane and come back. It was too difficult. So you had to make that decision. And it was like, why did my people leave? You were talking earlier about your people leaving Scotland. Why would they leave Glasgow in 1890? What was going on?
Yeah.
What was their reason for leaving? And that was a big decision that they had to make. Then they had to make the trip to the port. And they didn't always take the closest port, or the trip could have been very, very hard for them. They had to be able to exit the country they were in. And there, even for England after a while, there were rules that you had to meet before you could just say, I'm leaving to go to America. Whether it was getting a visa, paying a toll, or some kind of a a fine, if you left family members who couldn't take care of themselves, whatever it was, you had to make sure, unless you snuck out, that you could leave and actually come on to America. And then there were the ships. What would you like to know about the ships?
Well, I've read different stories and all, but they were not, as we look at the Titanic and what steerage was there, as I watched that movie and then thought back to things I've read, I thought, gee, that looks awfully, awfully good. The conditions look pretty good to me, other than once they hit the iceberg. But
yeah, that did kind of deter them a little bit. It kind of made the trip not so much fun. But in the beginning, people went into steerage, and I think we have a picture of a lot of people on a deck of a ship that make the deck is very, very crowded. And a lot of the pictures that we're going to see came from the National Archives. We've got another one, if we can find it. It's got more people kind of facing forward on the deck. This, though, is really very interesting because what they're doing here is that are their food pails. When you got into steerage and you got to your berth, they did give you these packets, like pails with places to hold fruit or plates or what have you. And you had to take care of those. And if you needed to wash them, you had to be very careful because they were a lousy tin. So if you let them out to dry, they would rust. If they got lost, too bad. If somebody stole them, too bad. Because when you're in steerage in the beginning, before things started to change, you had no room. If we can find the picture of all the bunks or cots, that is basically this is 1896. This was steerage. You had some tables that you could sit at, and you can see where the cots are stacked one on top of the other. There was no place to hang your clothes. There was no privacy. You kept anything you needed to store stayed on your bunk, unless you had the bottom bunk and you could put things underneath it. But there was nothing else. Now, men had a section, single women had a section, and then women with children had a section. So you did have that kind of division, but you could see there was no privacy. You wanted to get undressed and get ready for bed. Everybody else could tell. So you had that kind of a problem. That was where you found your food pail and everything. When the bell rang, you would go to where you got your food. If you weren't there in time, if they ran out, it was too bad. So you want to wash your dishes, and this brings us to bathrooms. You had to wash your dishes if you were in steerage by using the bathroom, which was not necessarily on the floor where steerage was. Now, steerage was not the lowest form. These are the bathrooms. The one on the top is, can you tell, it's first class.
No.
Quite nice. It had a bathtub. The one down below, no bathtub. It has, on the left, kind of like a trough, plus some sinks. You would take your dishes in there, where you washed up, and you would have to wash them in that tub. Plus, the crew would come in and wash their dishes there. And even though there was one bathroom for women and one bathroom for men, men would use the women's. They didn't care. So all of this was, you were in plain sight because you usually had to walk across a deck. So you went from your middle or tween deck, the cargo hold below you, the main deck above you, and you were in between. You would go upstairs, you would cross the deck, and you could go to the restroom, and everybody watching you. So immigrants and people in steerage were called, they were so dirty. This terrible. It was because of the conditions on the ship. I suggest, again, I've said this on other shows, look for any newspaper articles when your ship arrived in whatever port they arrived in. There was a Russian ship that arrived in about 1909, again, before changes were made, and the story read that a number of immigrants went into the bathroom at night, and when they turned, there was no hot water. It was only cold water. But when they turned on the faucet, steam from the ship had somehow backed up into these pipes. So when they opened it,
They got scalded.
they got scalded. And what the crew said, well, it was at night. They weren't supposed to be using the bathrooms at night anyway.
Right.
So this is the kind of things people were facing. And that, not the best way to travel.
Yes, yes.
So one thing that the U.S. Immigration Bureau did, and that's what it was called at that point in time, has gone through several iterations since then, but they started doing an investigation on the ships, what was going on. They had people go out and actually interview maybe ship owners or crews, quite open with what they were doing. They had some people that went undercover, so to speak. One was Kate Waller Barrett, who the Alexandria Library on Queen Street is named for. She was very concerned with what were happening to the women on these trips, and she wrote a lot about it. The other one who did 3 different trips undercover was a lady named Ann Herkner. And she kept what they called a word book, what we would call a diary at this point. And when the U.S. Immigration Bureau published all of this, it came out being called the Dillingham Report in about 1911. We learned a lot about what these immigrants in steerage, and it wasn't just immigrants in steerage, it was anybody. It could have been a U.S. citizen coming back from Europe, but it was the cheapest ticket, the cheapest way to travel, so you could have American citizens being down there as well and seeing what was happening to them and all the things that were going on. One of the things that they talked about was how much or lack of outdoor space that people in steerage had. I think we've got one photo that shows people sitting on, this was machinery that they were sitting on, and you could not go past that rope. That was all that they had in order for kids to play or whatever. And there was no kind of a sunroof, nothing that protected you from the elements. And the first class passengers, their outdoor area was up above it, so they could look down on the people from steerage and very often said nasty things and threw things at them. So it was really bad. This is where kids were playing. This was what they had. And it took the Dillingham Report and what these people going undercover like Anne, they took that and they made changes. So you can see now we've got one where women are on benches and doing some of their, for their outdoor, because there was no benches as you saw on the one. They just could not. So now we have benches and you could go out, and there was no light there at night before the changes were made. So you had to be out if you were on the deck at all, particularly if you were a woman. Well, you just didn't want to be out there because nice things did not happen.
Yeah, or you traveled in a crowd.
Right. But there was no way to see anything. You couldn't see because there were just no lights. So it was all really very, very hard for anyone traveling. And I think I'm so glad that my ancestors undertook this situation, and yours even faced it if they were in steerage from Scotland, because nothing had changed in 1890 too much.
Yeah, they were 1885 to 1892. So
I mean, we got better with the food and the air, and there were laws being passed, but as far as the actual traveling on the ship and the way people were treated was really very, very hard. And one thing that this Dillingham Report did, and that Ann Herkner wrote about, was once the changes were made, first of all, when you got on the ship, the ship owners, the ship line, had to give you a medical examination. Because if they sent someone who was sick and they got to, say, New York or whatever port they were in, say they had trachoma, which is a contagious eye disease, that person would be put in quarantine and would be deported back. And it was that ship that let them come over, that ship line. They paid for whatever food that person being detained ate, whether it was for one day or a week, because they had to wait for their next ship. Didn't have to be the same ship, but the next ship owned by that ship line to come pick that person up, and then they had to take them back. Plus, they were heavily fined. So that changed. We ended up getting people being examined. And remember, the manifest, the passenger list, was made at the port of embarkation when they got on, not when they got off in America. So that kind of thing changed. Anne wrote that, before the people in steerage had to sweep their own floors, they had to keep everything clean. There was no steward to take care of it.
Right.
Well, afterwards, they did have someone who would come in. You would leave at 9 o'clock so they could clean up everything. There were pegs for your clothes. People were treated nicely. You didn't have someone standing guard like they did beforehand. There was always someone in like the women's area. So they were outside if you needed help on something. And they actually ended up having entertainment afterwards. I think we've got a picture that shows where we have people dancing. And so they could have, it was lit now, you could actually have entertainment out there on nice days. You had places to sit. Things improved, but this wasn't till after about 1950 and up into 1920 when things like this actually started. But even with those improvements, the majority of immigrants, or the majority of even American citizens that were coming back from having been overseas, because it was still the cheapest way to travel, they still went steerage. And you were still very, very crowded. But you did have more room, you did have more privacy. So it made it a lot easier. The one thing that also changed, originally once you got here, if it was at a time before there was an immigration center, you could literally go to any port because any port was able to decide whether it was Boston, New York, Baltimore, their own rules. The federal government said, yes, we handle immigration, but we're leaving it up to the states, and also it was up to the colonies, to decide who could come in and who couldn't, what the requirements were, the criteria. So you would have people, they could write home, or they would have someone write home for them, and they would say things like, I came in through New York, but tell Uncle Wilhelm, because he's got a hernia, don't come in through New York because they'll think he won't be able to hold a charge or a job, and they're not going to let him in. But I understand it's really easier if he goes in through, say, Baltimore. So it might be why your ancestor came into a port that you didn't expect him to. Plus, the cost was cheaper depending on where you came from and where you were landing. So you want to look at all those things. It wasn't until the federal government said, look, all of these ports need to have the same rules and regulations for people to come in. So it didn't matter where you came in, you were facing the same criteria. New York was still seemed to be a little stricter, but be that as it may, you could go in any way you want, any place that you wanted to, but you had to pass certain tests, no matter what port you came into. And if you were sick, you would be deported, or maybe you were just waiting for a brother or a father or someone to come and pick you up. If you were a single woman, at least in New York, I'm not sure about the other ports, but in New York, if you were a single woman, they would not let you out of Ellis Island after it opened because it wasn't safe for them to be on the streets. But it had to be a male relative. And sometimes, there comes her fiance, and they say, well, you're not a relative. They would actually march them down to the courthouse and marry them so she could leave with him. But so there were those types of things that you had to be careful for. You might have been detained for a few days. You were waiting for money to be sent to you so you could buy your railroad ticket or whatever. And if everything went well, you actually didn't spend but a couple of hours basically going through the reception center. if things didn't go well, you might have had a new medical test, you might have had a mental test, all different sorts of things that would take place.
Yeah, and of course, I went to Ellis Island years ago, and it really is a great learning experience going there because they take you through like the rooms where they did medical tests and explain some of the things that people were tested for, and why they may be rejected over somebody else being let in, things like that.
And you could go to a board of special inquiry and say, I don't think this is right, or or you could appeal that decision. It was lengthy, but you can do it. But you weren't left, once the federal government took over and opened federal reception centers, you weren't left alone.
Yeah.
You had immigrant aid societies there, like 40 different ones. There were places to eat. There were 2 separate kitchens, one kosher, one for everybody else. There were 2 dining rooms, so things could be separated and done properly. So you weren't left in the lurch. You could do everything inside Ellis Island that you could do inside Castle Garden when it opened. You could exchange your money at a fair rate. You could find a good place to spend the night. You could find your transportation to a train station. But the interesting thing that I find, people think, oh, I'm going to put my name into a database, and up will come that page of the passenger list. And yeah, it may depending on indexing. But they'll take that page, and sometimes they won't look anymore. You need to look even farther. Go to that first page, find out where the ship took off from, because maybe it was an indirect. It may have made stops along the way. People may have died. There'll be information. Maybe that family story that great-grandpa was born at sea can be proven if you look maybe at the last page of that
That's
ship.
one of the things I've always heard, and I've actually seen. Looking at the last page of the passenger list will tell you if somebody died en route. But the other thing is, although they really tried very hard to prevent women who were pregnant from getting on board because they didn't want that to occur, but if it did, they would be listed on there. I've seen some of the lists where that has been recorded.
And they actually needed to make those notations because the number of people that got on the ship should be the same number that got off. But okay, I have 3 more people that got off than got on. Well, I have 3 births here, or I have 2 people less. Well, I had 2 deaths. So you can actually say that it's there. The other thing, when people were detained or to either be deported or wait for money or a family member or what have you, at least in New York, and I'm not sure, I have never had the reason to check other ports like Angel Island in California, but the detaining reports they're at the end of that particular manifest, and you can find out whether or not your ancestor was detained for any reason. And it will tell you, if so, how many days were they there, because it gives you, they had so many breakfasts, so many lunches, and so many dinners that shipping company was going to have to pay for.
Yeah, so it's very important not just to find your ancestor. Look at the whole thing.
Definitely.
To the very end, because you don't know what you're going to find.
And going back to the beginning when we talked about leaving a country, some of the paperwork, the visas or whatever was necessary, still exist. I know for some places in Germany, you can still get them on microfilm from Family Search and find maybe papers that your ancestor may have had to go through in order to be able to leave that country, or at least find out what were the requirements before they were allowed to leave whatever country they were going to depart from.
And one of the things interesting things I did for a client, the client was looking for the family on a passenger list leaving Germany. The oldest son was supposedly 17 and the next oldest 16, and they normally at the time would not be allowed to leave because they were approaching eligibility where they could be drafted. Well, I did fairly easily find the family. But what I found was, instead of Christian 17, I found Christina 18, and I forget, I think the second one's name was John.
So Johanna.
He was only listed as 17, but listed as a male. And so, what the client and I theorized was he went out incognito to get out of, but it was a whole family of, I think there were 6 or 7 children, and of course most of the others were younger age, but they got out of Germany evidently. Somehow he was able to slip through incognito.
And one thing to remember, if the husband came first and the wife and the children came later, if it is a country where the women kept their maiden names, remember, you need to look for that woman under the maiden name. And I have found for a client, he said, I can't find them, I can't find them. And I went.
Particularly, I believe Italy and France were two of them.
And there were some others, but always check the maiden name if you know what it is, because that's how you might be able to find them. And just like census records, just because her name may have been, her family name, her maiden name, and kids had the father's name, sometimes on that passenger list, just like census records, they all got mommy's name.
Sharon, time has gone so fast, as it always does, but this, I think, is so interesting and so helpful. I mean, I read through all your notes, and I didn't know so much about the commissions that they did and all, but we appreciate you taking your time to come up and visit us. And
my pleasure.
Hopefully we'll get you to come up again in the future.
We'll do a little enticement here.
Yeah.
But I enjoyed it.
Thank you.